Okay, hello everybody, and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whenever you're watching this. My name is Tom Hall. I'm with Tech for Palestine, and I'm here with Robin Andersen to discuss her new book, The Complicit Lens: U.S. Media Coverage of Israel's Genocide in Gaza, published by OR Books with the Institute for Palestine Studies. Robin is Professor Emerita of Media Studies at Fordham University and an award-winning author of a dozen single and co-authored books. Her work examines film, television, and media coverage of war, the environment, politics, and elections. She edits the Routledge Focus book series on media and humanitarian action, serves as a project censored judge, and contributes to the annual State of the Free Press. She is on the board of directors of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR, where she also writes regularly, and is an Izzy Award judge for the Park Center for Independent Media. Her writing has appeared in Counterpunch, LA Progressive, The Progressive, Salon, Common Dreams, and Sheer Post, among others. So, Robin, welcome.
It's great to be here, Tom. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And as we were discussing right before this began, I just finished reading the book myself. It's really extraordinary body of work. And yeah, why don't you just, if you could, just take us off by just giving an overview of what the book is about and why you wrote it.
Right. Well, what I tried to do in the book is kind of document the media coverage, and that was the first thing. But what I do is try to compare the establishment, legacy, mainstream. We call those by all the same names, really, or big journalism too is one of my favorites. To show how they presented a very constructed story uh, following October 7th, and it started at October 7th, and that was the only beginning point that mattered, the origin, and that they basically had a very pro-Israeli news frame that followed Israeli talking points, that deliberately obscured Israel's actions in Gaza, that used passive language, and that drew on common tropes of Arab terrorists, lawlessness, and things like that to present a very one-sided view of what they called Israel, the war between Israel and Hamas. I kind of contrast that to the profoundly brave Palestinian journalists who were on the ground in Gaza and who documented what they were seeing and what Israel was doing when they were dropping 2,000-pound bombs, the actual effects on civilians, the very things that establishment media was trying to deny and obscure. So we have these two different realities. One was what was really on the ground, and the other is how media constructed this story. And then I use sources also for the on the ground media to kind of balance, in my view, the establishment media coverage and talk about how alternative and independent and many international outlets were also quoting and using sources of aid workers, UN workers, and many of the people involved in Euromed, from the doctors, all of those kinds of sources that you rarely saw in the mainstream media.
Yeah, that's a really good overview, and I found it was an amazing resource because even though I have been obsessively following the news for the last 2.5 years, seeing it all, compiled in one place and with the extensive footnotes that you have there, it's one of the thoughts that I just kept having while I was reading it is like this is going to be evidence in The Hague one day.
That's exactly what I was thinking too, Tom. Exactly
Yeah,
what I was thinking. And
yeah.
when you see it
So
all at once, we forget things. I mean, but it's been happening relatively fast. I mean, so fast, most well documented live stream genocide in history, and yet the most contested. And it happened very soon, very quickly.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and you know, just to put cards on the table, I'm one of those unfortunate people who didn't know anything about Israel Palestine before October 7th. Um, but I knew enough to know that it didn't start on October 7th. So immediately when I started seeing that narrative after October 7th, I was like, this is ridiculous. But seeing, you know, the way you put together like exactly how this happens, and um, you know, it's not a conspiracy theory. It's yeah. So maybe if you could just talk about that, like how exactly does it work that the media apparatus like follows a narrative without necessarily there being like, you know, somebody sitting in a dark smoky room deciding like who's going to talk about what.
Well, no, it wasn't a conspiracy theory, but there is a chapter in the book where I talk about the compromised media landscape. And there really was a lot of Israeli military idea talking points involved in the editorial decision making by, and this is well documented at CNN, at the New York, and at the New York Times. When the journalists themselves leaked the documents, they were being told what they could and could not say. They leaked those documents to the Intercept, and that was it. That was a pretty big story in the alternative and independent press. Anyway, but this story of the origin story of October 7th as the beginning of the violence is a standardized media frame and a one that's frequently used for war, because the enemy that the United States has identified as their enemy, they become immediately within the press dehumanized, and the war frame begins with the violence from them, right? So this kind of very standard encapsulation of events that have a long historical flow and long genesis, to where it comes to conflict, can be completely ignored, and it can be just beginning at this one point where Hamas created the violence, or Hamas did violence, and then that only leaves how are Israelis going to respond? It's defensive. It's always retaliatory violence on the part of the other side. If you, according to the way this news frame structures the discourse and structures how we talk about it. And interestingly, when the New York Times told their journalists that they took out a whole bunch of words that they couldn't use, such as occupation, apartheid, genocide, massacre, refugee camp. These were the words that we use to explain exactly a genocide. So the journalists were restricted in their ability to explain to their readers and viewers, and I say readers and viewers because of course the Times has a lot of visuals, but also this is the paper of record. The New York Times employs 7% of all the journalists working in the United States. They've got 3,000 journalists. Certainly some of those journalists could have looked up the rules of war, humanitarian law, and pointed out all of these things that the alternative and independent press were writing about. They were writing about the disproportionate violence. They were writing about collective punishment, and these are war crimes. All of those words and that body of principles that were developed after World War II to prevent genocide were excluded from a media frame. So you've got this Hamas as terrorists because there's no reason for them to have done this, no reason whatsoever, not Israel's history of oppression of Palestinians, the fact that Gaza was occupied and the rest of the Palestinian territories, and that the human rights organizations had already identified Israeli rules and laws and and unequal treatment to the Israeli citizens, to the Palestinian citizens, as an apartheid state. So that's and the October 7th narrative itself had many flaws.
Yeah, and you go into that in some detail, and that still astonishes me to this day. I just remember, you know, watching in real time Biden standing at a podium repeating debunked claims about beheaded babies. With it. It's really remarkable.
It was, and later they actually admitted it. Yeah, that's also documented in the book, where they finally go, oh yeah, well, yeah, our people were telling us, even in the State Department, that this was genocide, but we didn't report that. We didn't say that.
Yeah, and some of the words that the Times banned that you mentioned, like ethnic cleansing, occupation, refugee camp. I mean, these are just facts. You know, this isn't like. I mean, I don't agree with, but I can understand somebody saying, well, you know, the jury is still out on whether or not it's technically a genocide. At least there's some rational basis for that argument, but there's no basis for denying that there's an occupation or that these are refugee camps. I mean, these are just facts.
That's right. But the news frame, yes, these were excluded so that they wouldn't even come into the discourse. So, for example, as one of the New York journalists reported, who was a source for the internet, they said they didn't want us to say occupation, and we said, some of us said, if you take occupation out of the language, you're taking the core of the conflict out, and people can't understand what it's about, right? But actually, and in CNN, they were also instructed, just start with October 7th. You see how important October 7th was, that they left the journalists with no historical background to talk about, and you always had to start with October 7th. And then when it was reported that Israel was doing creating another massacre, bombing the Jabalia refugee camp, their soldiers were on top of the aid trucks and they were shooting down at Palestinians. You know, they simply denied all of that stuff, and journalists on the ground were reporting what was really going on.
Yeah, and I've obviously followed Bisan and Plestia and Motaz and a lot of different journalists that were in Gaza, that have left Gaza since the very beginning, and there's consistency, of course, in everything that they say. It's not like this was, nobody's making anything up. I mean, we're seeing things with our own eyes and then being told, not to believe our lying eyes. But
right, and we were being gaslighted, and I think that's a good word for what Israel does in the media. And Ismail Al-Gould was one that I followed. I really got so much out of his reporting. For example, in the spring of 2024, with the flower massacre, where they were already starving the Palestinians, and they were very hungry, and the Israeli soldiers were on top of the aid trucks. And when they arrived, the Israelis started firing on the crowd. So Ismail Al-Gould wrote the truth on the ground, and then the New York Times and other press outlets referred to it with these euphemisms and passive voices. Gosh, it was aid-related deaths. These were aid-related deaths, and it was aid-related chaos, and very obscure terms. And when Ismail Al-Gould reported it, he also went to the hospital close by, and Euromed Human Rights also documented what they saw. So the Israelis had said, oh, they trampled each other and it was chaos, and they were really trying to get to the trucks. And Al-Gould, writing for Al Jazeera, didn't report any of that stuff. But when they went to the morgue and saw the bodies, they had holes in them. They were not trampled to death by each other. This is not the lawlessness frame, which is so popular in media frames. If elites can't control what people are doing, right? Anyway, Ismail Agu was on the ground, and to the incredibly brave journalists, to their credit, many of them, they came back. They had to, because of their injuries and what they were living through. Many stayed for the whole time, and eventually they were killed by Israel. And then they became targeted, and as Israel became more and more aggressive with their impunity, they would just say, "Oh, they're terrorists." So, "Oh, they were associated with Hamas." "Oh, they were involved in October 7th," and none of that was true. The Committee for the Protection of Journalists and other investigative journalism advocacy organizations have done many investigations into the most egregious charges and killing and direct targeting of journalists, and they haven't found one case that was true.
Yeah, that is so infuriating. I think the number is like, is it 270 or
Yeah,
more journalists?
probably a bit
Um,
more if you it depends on the way you your methods and who you are counting. There are many media workers, so you would
yeah,
get different numbers, but that's about right.
yeah, and then healthcare workers too, right? And the healthcare system, hospitals. I distinctly remember in the very early days of the genocide there being, all the drama around the Al Hil hospital,
Al
where
Shafi, Al Safia, no, Al Shifa
is it?
Hospital, Al
No, I
Shifa.
don't think it was not Al Shifa. It
There
was
are a lot.
right.
Yeah, you may be thinking
Yeah,
of
yeah,
another.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It was right in the beginning where like they were trying to. Oh well, it was Hamas
Yeah.
rocket that blew up in the parking lot. And no, no, no. It was, and there was
Yes.
this big debate because it would be horrifying to think that somebody would
Mhm.
have intentionally bombed a hospital, and then they just go on to bomb every hospital in Gaza. And
Right.
yeah,
That's
so
exact. Yeah. Go ahead.
go ahead.
That's exactly how they normalized it. So you say something completely false, and you offer this pseudo evidence. Israel likes to give them some aerial footage, and then you have to take some time to say, well, this isn't anything. It's not even the place, right? So many times there were Arabs on the phone. They had different accents. This didn't have anything to do with what they were claiming. So that's what I also talked about in the book, is the pseudo evidence that Israel was constantly feeding to journalists. And they would dutifully report it, and then say, "Oh, well, the Gaza health ministry says this, but Israel says that." Then you debate the details and who is lying. And then, meanwhile, you go on to the next hospital and take it out. And so that's a process of normalization that happened throughout, arguing the details, avoiding what Israel's really doing, which is creating, which is committing terrible war crimes. Israel was very good also at distorting the idea of war crimes and twisting them around. So when they later went into Al Shifa Hospital, saying there was a Hamas Pentagon underneath with all this whack video, slick 3D video that showed the supposed Pentagon, they everybody was talking about that. And then when they go in, um, and they kill, doctors and patients, and attack a hospital, unprecedented almost in war. And um and later discovered, when the Washington Post does an investigation, that none of it was true, though the places they said were occupied showed no evidence of occupation by Hamas, or holding hostages. And um and the tunnels they said were connected were in fact not connected to the main hospital. All of those things, you don't report on it. But media also followed this Israeli talking point that if Hamas or belligerent fighters that you're against are in a hospital, you get to go in, and they're only protected if other fighters aren't in there. In fact, that's not true. You cannot destroy a hospital, kill doctors and their patients, even if Hamas was in that hospital. You are obliged to to make sure that the doctors and patients in the hospital are safe. So that's how the law goes, and that's what Israel was able to twist about And the mainstream and legacy media, with all of their money and all of their resources and all of their researchers, never seems to understand that when you and I can easily go on the internet and find that material.
Yeah, and that is just so absurd. Like I can't even like any rational human being, if you ask them, if there's a gunman takes a hostage in a hospital in Idaho, like is it a good response or a legal response, or even a reasonable response to like bomb the hospital? And like, I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, right. And the Doctors Without Borders were there, and they were begging the international community. They were saying, we're under attack here. We've actually invited international observers to come in and show you that there's no Hamas. Um, but for that one, the Biden administration was terribly involved and complicit, and they couldn't really, I don't think, have gotten away with it without, as you mentioned before, the way the State Department and U.S. government officials were lying, and they cited unnamed intelligence reports and sources that confirmed, oh yeah, Hamas was under that hospital. It never was. It was a lie, absolute lie. And Jeremy Scahill said, this is Biden's war, and he's got blood on his hands after Al Shifa. Many journalists just couldn't believe how they got away with the attack on Al Shifa, the first one, and now the entire healthcare system is wiped out. We know that.
Yeah, and Dr. Abu Safia is still being tortured in their prison dungeons for the crime of being a pediatrician at Al Shifa.
When I think about him in that, I can't bear it. He was such a brave man and so incredible. Can't bear
Yeah,
it.
yeah, and so one of the points that you make in the book, which I thought was really good, was that you know in every other conflict, war, et cetera, around the world, like the news elevates like the word of human rights organizations, United Nations reports, medical journals, testimony from doctors, and then all of a sudden, none of those things have any relevance or importance in the media today. Like, can you talk about like how is that? Yeah, is that something you've even seen anywhere else?
Well, they had other ways that they talked about the war on terror. More what they did is turn the war on terror into entertainment, and I've written about a lot because I've been writing about war and media for a long time. Tom. It's like terrible. Anyway, they had ways of distracting from the war on terror too, very early on, and you know, there was a lot of this battlefield propaganda that mimicked film scripts and stuff. So that Saving Private Ryan became Saving Private Lynch, the young woman who was taken out of a hospital. So it was also U.S. media went in with soldiers, and so that was turned into a reality show. And I asked one journalist before they went in, I said, "Are you going to, if U.S. soldiers kill somebody or a civilian is dead in the crossfire, are you going to report on that?" She literally said, "No, we are telling the U.S. side of the story." So over time, media has been dealing with this, but it was less obvious. What you couldn't do with the genocide in Gaza is turn it into entertainment. So that whole frame didn't work, right? This is not entertaining. Thank God the global publics had those Palestinian journalists on the ground that were telling us what was going on, that were documenting the testimony. We could see with our own eyes on our handheld devices, especially young people who get most of their news from it. So you couldn't turn this one into an entertainment spectacle. So the ways that I documented in the book was kind of new, this kind of trying to define this pro-Israel genocide frame. And really what it was misdirection and basically on the part of journalists to follow those talking points. when there was documentation out there that proved that they were not true, and that this was not a war against Israel and Hamas, but a deliberate genocide and the killing of civilians in a small area, and that kind of genocidal brutality. And there's no way you can understand it on the part of the legacy media as anything but journalism malpractice. And in this is the worst case.
Yeah, and you actually pointed out that, and I didn't know this, but that the Columbia Spectator and the Harvard Crimson actually covered things like the encampments more accurately and honestly than the mainstream media. Is that right?
Absolutely, those students were so terrific, and their journalism. Oh, I mean, it just shone a bright light, and it was very thorough. The students themselves in the encampment too. When they went in and they renamed the building Hind Hall, of course they were referring to the 5-year-old girl who was stuck in the car for hours trying to be rescued. That then the voice of Hind Rajab, that wonderful film, tells us it. I people I know that people felt bad about the movie and the depictions, but I felt that the movie got to tell the story of the rescue, the first responders and the rescue workers. We got to see the humanity of the Palestinians as they tried to save him. And never mind, they couldn't, and they took out some of their last crews, their first responders, with them when they arrived on the scene. The Israelis just killed them and buried their ambulance, and but they were able to tell their story. So that was the end of January 2024. The students called the new building Hind Hall by the late March. So really, within 2 months, they knew that story. So when when the NYPD goes in and attacks the students on campus, and this happened in many other places, certainly after Columbia as well, they called it. They had to do it because there were outside agitators on campus. Um, there were outside agitators, and outside agitators is another standard media frame and common way in which hegemonic tropes influence news reporting. So if you have outside agitators, well then, since these people are really coming in and they're agitating, you are then allowed to go and attack them violently, and that's what happened. Meanwhile, these weren't outside agitators at all. The students were more knowledgeable about everything that was going on in Gaza. They were attempting to speak about it themselves. I write about in the book that this was a really amazing moment on university campuses where they were creating what we call a beloved community, where everybody was getting together and discussing and talking and wondering, what was the best way to proceed. And also the students brought the issue that was also already being discussed. The American public at that point was realizing they didn't want any more weapons to be sent to Israel. They didn't want their tax dollars and Americans to support this war. Even by then, Tom, it was the spring of 2024. So we knew what was going on, but nevertheless, they went in and they brutalized the students, and then they locked down the campuses, and it's been terrible for freedom of expression and of any kind in American universities. Only accelerated and made much worse by Donald Trump.
Yeah, I grew up in Ann Arbor and I live near there now. So the University of Michigan was one of the encampments, and one of the ones in which the Democratic Attorney General attempted to charge 7 of the encampment um, participants with felony crimes, but did eventually drop those charges. But yeah, And I honestly, I wanted to go and support the encampment, but I was afraid, like not being a student, that I would be identified as an outside agitator. So like it was, it was,
You,
yeah,
well, universities like, I'm emerita at Fordham, and in the Fordham campus in the Bronx, we have outreach, programs in universities to reach out to the community and to do joint things with them, including development and housing in the Bronx. Fordham is very into this. That's why it's so ironic that the community of the Upper West Side and in Manhattan, if they were outside agitators, and these weren't students. This has been something that's been a positive aspect, that universities have been trying to develop these relationships for years. So, everything gets turned around when you're trying to justify violence. Ironically, Columbia had employed a adjunct professor there who was the counterterrorism consultant to Eric Adams at the New York Police Department. She also had an office in Tel Aviv. So she was basically an Israeli spy, you might say. And she's the one who was talking to Eric Adams about the outside agitators. Um, Again, that was just the professors. Many people said this is just the worst distortion and misdirection we've ever seen in media.
yeah. That's and going back to that. So how do you, I saw Chomsky and Herman's manufacturing consent documentary like 30 years ago, and then again recently, and so I understand a lot of this, but it's one of these things that they argue in manufacturing consent is that, especially in the United States, we have this requirement of like concision in media, and which prevents people from having the opportunity to like explain nuanced topics in the detail that they deserve. So under those circumstances, like it of course makes sense that we were getting a lot of information from social media. I learned a lot about Israel Palestine from TikTok in the early days of the genocide, because that's just where the news was coming through. Like I just wasn't seeing it in the, and then of course I'm watching Al Jazeera and Channel 4 and like other, but watching American media is just absurd. So so that makes me wonder, though. I mean, yeah, I guess what are your thoughts? Like, where do people go? I think that people like they watch CNN, they watch Fox News because these are like aggregators of news that where they think like, well, if I want to get like a well-rounded, idea of what's happening in the world, I need to go to one like trusted source or I mean, obviously that's absurd, but I feel like that's what most people seem to do. Um, so like, what is the alternative? Because let me reframe that a little bit, because when I first saw Manufacturing Consent 30 years ago, at the end of the film, because I haven't read the book, but I watched a documentary about the book, and at the end of the film, they were offering like all these alternative news sources. Of course, this was pre-internet, so it was like all these, you can go to the library, you can go to these, little independent bookstores and find these alternative newspapers, and you can find these VHS tapes that have more information, and it was just sort of like, oh, okay, so if I want to know what's really happening in the world, I basically have to make this my full-time job. And um, yeah, who's going to do that? So what is the answer? I mean, this is a big, broad question. I'm sure I'm not expecting you to have an answer for this, but like, what do you tell people who say, where should I go to like find out what's really happening?
Well, the book. Um, I think I think that we were so, I don't know, cautious about being attacked and labeled various things, that the book is so well documented that it's has more footnotes than text almost. I don't even notice. Um, I think you can see an enormous amount of sources that I drew on to contrast and help debunk the mainstream media frame. And in those footnotes there are everything from mostly online great news sources, Mondowise, the Electronic Intifada, the Gray Zone, Mint Press News. There are alternative and independent sources that are wide available. I've also learned since I've been um, promoting the book that there's an awful lot of really good podcasts out there too. There's podcasts, there's all kinds of information, and most of this material is simply internet based and different social media platforms and sharing patterns. We talked about TikTok. I used to find Twitter. It took me a long time to say X, and then I said Twitter X, and now you just have to say X, which is horrible. But look what Elon Musk did to Twitter, and look what they did to TikTok. Is like now they're starting to attack those online sources, and they have been attacking them for a very long time by stopping their PayPal accounts. They've taken a lot of Palestinian um, websites off Facebook, websites or and Facebook groups. So we're seeing that now. In terms of the manufacturing consent, I think that the Herman Chomsky Herman model and the propaganda model has been great for understanding a lot of how mainstream media has worked, and particularly lots of other material about the standardization of the media frame. Like you don't want to be out there with a different story. You want to be kind of within the pack. There was an old book called The Boys on the Bus, which illustrated that. But they all kind of talked to each other together in a foreign country and came up with, okay, this is how we're gonna frame our stories. Is what we're gonna say. That hasn't worked with October 7th precisely because it became very obvious to, some of the best critics of media were on social media. I mean, you'll notice that I'm quoting a lot of people. I became aware of Asal Rod and Alan McLeod was really great writing for Mint Press News when he altered the headlines. Sana Saeed, fault lines from Al Jazeera. They were really prominent in showing exactly at the time what Israel was doing with the media frame and how Israel controlled the establishment media narrative for quite a while. Um, so many of us were trying to debunk it at the moment. I think that the Israeli lobby had been effective for years prior to October 7th, where we did kind of have a consensus pro-Israel view. Israel was the safe place, the city, the country on the hill that we all aspired to. It was really so important for it to thrive, and it never thrived. They started going right wing. Anyway, that image of Israel has now been completely destroyed globally and in the United States. Um, they did not successfully manufacture consent post October 7th. My main point about the book, however, is right in the beginning, where the Israeli officials and defense ministers and military people announced to the world what they were going to do in Gaza. They were going to stop their electricity. They were going to destroy their housing. They would turn it into a tent city. There would be no food, no water. They told the world these are all crimes against humanity. You can't do that. Nobody right at the start said, and you didn't point out there, it was Joe Biden, Israel has a right to defend itself. Full stop. What does full stop mean? They can do anything. So that was incitement. That is actually against international law. It's called incitement to violence. Incitement to genocide. Many people understand that you can't have genocide without the precursor of incitement. And that's what they got away with in the beginning. And that's how it gained momentum so rapidly. So somebody at CNN said, again, back to the leaked documents, to the Intercept, telling people what was sending all their scripts to their Jerusalem bureau, and it was being vetted by the IDF. So CNN said in that one of their sources many of us, when we saw our anchors simply repeating what the Israelis said they were going to do in Gaza, this sounded an awful lot like incitement to violence, he said, incitement to genocide, that comprised the first 7 pages of the South African suit in front of the International Criminal Court charging in Israel with genocide. So that's when it started. That's when I think also that the establishment media didn't care that there was protests, that there were alternative views. They didn't leave any academics. There were no Palestinian intellectuals, poets, writers. All these people were excluded from the frame. They didn't care about them. They were only appealing to Israeli sources, military industrial complex, and that's where the media has gone.
Yeah, and it's so any sort of association with Hamas that just seemed to be like all they default to. It's like every Palestinian was Hamas, everybody in Gaza was Hamas, the 5-year-olds are Hamas, and yeah, and that was something that you addressed in your book also about how you're not even allowed to like hear Hamas's point of view, or but if you even consider that they might have a point of view that is worth hearing, then you're a Hamas supporter. And yeah.
Right. Yes, the media itself defined it as an Israel-Hamas war. Well, what happened to their both sides of the story? You're supposed to be fair and balanced and accurate. Fair, balanced, and accurate, really. There's objectivity is a whole other thing, and there's no such thing as that. But you've got to be
Yeah.
accurate and you've got to be balanced. And Hamas was only recounted through the words and the eyes of the U.S. and the Israelis most often. We had to go to Jeremy Scahill to hear what finally, as he got the sources, as Dropside got the sources, to hear what Hamas was actually saying. What they were actually doing. But to call it an Israel-Hamas war was completely ridiculous, and it was because they were attacking civilians and they were simply saying everybody was Hamas. So okay, so they can say it, but at one point in the book I talk about, fine, you can say what you want. It's up to journalism to offer us an accurate perspective of what's going on and put it within a context of background knowledge so we can understand it. And they refuse to do that.
Yeah, which is, as you said, just journalistic malpractice. There's no other way of describing it, really. I read a book recently. It was a Walter Lippmann, A Test of the News. I don't know if you are familiar with that, but basically he and a co-author did a review of the New York Times coverage of the Russian Revolution. This was in 1920, and he published this 100-page review of the coverage just to show how skewed the coverage was. It was so subtle back then, like they're just in what they omitted and what they emphasized and just how they wanted to frame the narrative. And now I was thinking about this as I was reading your book, like how just upfront they are about it now, and they just blatantly, they know that we can all see with our own eyes what's happening, and they're just saying the opposite. It's just
Right.
it's wild.
Yes. And now they've got so emboldened. We haven't talked much about the rape story, but that was a really bad case of malpractice too. And actually, also the worst kind of trauma porn ever seen in contemporary journalism, and it was really uncalled for because there wasn't one viable first-person witness. There was no reliable witness testimony. There was no evidence. There was no forensic evidence, no visual evidence. All of the sources had already been discredited. And yet, when Nicholas Kristof finally acknowledges that Palestinian prisoners have been being tortured and raped in Israeli prisons for years, documented by so many human rights organizations. Then they're going to balance it with another Isabel Kirshner story the following day about how yet another Israeli 2-year investigation has been done, and oh, indeed, Hamas did rape women on October 7th. And there's volumes and 10,000 videotapes and pictures. But you know what? We can't let you see them because this would be bad for the family. And again, so that what they've done is they've balanced this awful frame that they've done for so long, and then balance this one acknowledgement finally by Nicholas Kristof in an op-ed piece, uh, and they're going to balance it yet with another set of constructed false, unverifiable. Let's just say unverifiable evidence. And that just shows you, like, some people are saying, "Wow, the New York Times finally did this. They finally told the truth. They're atoning." They're not atoning, I don't think. They're responsible for so much. Um, and if you think about the timing of that "Screams Without Words" rape story, front page story in the New York Times. Oh, by the way, in the where the family of the poor woman that they featured absolutely said she was not raped, and they said that the New York Times lied to them. I mean, this was the most discredited story, ever. Um, and when you think of the timing of that story, that was right when the South Africa case was presented to the International Court of Justice. So, I don't think we need to laud the New York Times for finally allowing one of their most respected human rights journalists from telling finally the truth that's been documented long ago, and then balance it with more unverifiable supposed evidence.
Yeah, it's really nonsensical. Uh, so one question so all the polling, is from what I've seen and heard and whatever, seems to indicate that Israel's popularity is in the toilet, especially in the West and especially in the U.S. And as well it should be. But what do you account for that? Like, is that, or how do you account for that? Like, is it because social media is letting the truth really get out, or something else?
Lots of people have talked about our own native humanity, our own kind of our own moral compasses. It's long been known that civilian populations really have to be pushed to support a war. That's why war propaganda was invented in the beginning of the 20th century to go with World War One. We came up with with the with the slaughter of innocents when we were trying to get the U.S. into when the Brits were trying to get the U.S. into World War One. There were stories of German soldiers bayoneting babies. Then during the War on Terror, their babies were thrown out of their incubators, and then now we've got Hamas beheading 40 babies. One baby was killed on October 7th. One child under 2 years old. That was published within a month because Israel knew who was killed right away. And that was the insurance agency. It was an official site. You could find it. And yet the 40 beheaded baby story. So that's the kind of atrocity propaganda that you have to work with, because we know that war in our heart of hearts is about mass murder. Though the military industrial media complex has tried to convince us otherwise for 20 years now, that it's really fun in war and about valor and all kinds of other things. But we know it's about mass murder. And when we watched it, there's the combination of our own sensibilities as people, I think. And then when we saw it verified, and then when Israel became more and more, propaganda, what we've showed in the past is propaganda doesn't work for the second time in the same war. You've got to keep evolving your propaganda, and it's for it to be effective. And you can't, and also about propaganda, it has to be a totalizing environment. You can't have noise. You can't have alternatives. That's why mainstream media never tells anybody about the opposition or the opposition to war, never features those kind of people before we head into a war. All of that was crumbled during this genocide, where it continued and continued, and Israel became increasingly outrageous. And we saw they're really trying to do this ethnic cleansing in Palestine. They're really looking for greater Israel finally. So at the one point they would deny everything, and then we could easily see that they were boasting on the other hand about what they were doing. This kind of strange contradiction also emerged when Ben Gvir recently showed the videotape of how Israel, and he particularly, were abusing and beating and putting the flotilla members, after they arrested them illegally in international waters, how they were putting them in stress positions. And then we heard over and over all of these testimony from so many people and then sexual assault. Who would think of raping people after you pick them up who thinks that? I mean, that's ridiculous. It's the most horrifying things. We naturally, as human beings, we don't like that. Humans don't like to hear that. Um, so the way that worked is, oh, now Israel is oh, Ben Gvir is the face. It's all about this one guy, Ben Gvir. And then when more and more testimonies came out, you can't say this is one person and save face in Israel. We know perfectly well that the Israelis now have been doing this to Palestinians for years. It's well documented and it's horrible. And I think we got to see through the eyes of the Palestinians as we saw the same treatment through the eyes of Westerners. And I think it took that because of the extreme dehumanization of Palestinians for all these years.
Yeah, and ongoing, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, I was going to open I meant to open to questions, but I'm not really sure. This is our first time doing this, so I'm not really sure, like, the technically how we would go about asking questions.
Well, we could
But
look at some of the chats and see if people have questions.
yeah, let's see.
Um, There's a lot of comments, and I'm very happy with the comments. This is disturbing to watch. Why does no one seem outraged? And we thought Abu Ghraib was bad. And yes, these are great comments, and all of this was true.
Yeah.
And I wish we had a free and fair press. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, no, I'm just noticing the same things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the whole Ben Gvir thing, like, they tried the same thing with Netanyahu in the beginning. It's like, oh, it's this Netanyahu, it's the Netanyahu government that's the problem, and yeah, it's impossible really to pay attention to what's happening there and not see that this goes way deeper than any particular administration. The B'Tselem report, "Welcome to Hell," about the network of Israeli prisons as torture camps. That's a shocking document.
Yes. Here's a good question from Khalid Azer that I think we've gotten close to answering it. So it doesn't show that the press, well, I think he means the press, or they mean the press was deliberate, and the lies were probably wrong, and that the response was just their way of their own allies to avoid implementing their own laws of sanctions. And I think that the audience for this distorted frame that I've been and you've been talking about, Tom, is that indeed it was directed to government elites and to those who wanted to continue what they were doing militarily in Gaza, the genocide. And I think as long as they see that represented in their press, they think that then, okay, we can get away with this. We're getting away with this. But what they do is they stay in a propaganda bubble and they don't know what's going on really anymore. And if they're determined to do it, and yes, that is exactly who this coverage was appealing to.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and then somebody pointed out this is tragedy. Yes, these are not crimes committed. Yes, the tragedy, the aid truck, food, chaos.
Yeah, it's
This was
like,
tragedy.
yeah,
It wasn't deliberate.
yeah. like a natural disaster, like an earthquake or something. I have had the opportunity to meet and speak with Colonel Anthony Aguilar, who came back from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and testified about what was happening over there, and it's just nightmarish.
Right. And this is a great question. How do we change the Israeli media indoctrination of their children? From Veda Williams. Um, I think that Israel has to be held accountable. I think that the population needs to see that the world, and with this kind of coverage, that this is the other people that they're appealing to. They have to see that the world understands that this is not normal anymore. When you get rape riots where they get mad because they're prosecuting a soldier that raped a Palestinian prisoner. There's something wrong with what's going on there. They've been indoctrinated, fear instillation, instilled with fear and all of this stuff, and they need to be held accountable by the international community um, to be able to do this. And how do we hold our own media accountable? I think it's time we held them accountable too. And I'm like Tom. I'd like to see this I'd like to see them in front of the Hague, because what they've done is that this is incitement to violence, especially what I was talking about in the beginning, and that's just a crime. That's a genocide crime. I'm sorry to say. If you notice, when Trump said, "I'm going to destroy the entire civilization," they came out against Trump, saying that sounds a lot like genocide, and that this would be a crime, and this would be incitement. They pointed out that about Trump, but never Netanyahu in Israel.
Yeah, that is a really good point, actually. Yeah, I didn't even notice, or I didn't catch that. Yeah. Okay, well, this has been great. This has been a great conversation, Robin. Thank you so much for joining. And I see the Rafat El-Arir book behind you. That's great.
There's my book.
He's
his
amazing.
book is wonderful. It's wonderful.
Yeah, it is. That poem was one of the first. The actor Brian Cox reading "If I Must Die" was one of the early videos I saw on social media that I found really compelling.
Yeah, me too. I just love to hear them. Their writing is so powerful, and that's why we just can't hear it. I don't see how I can respond to the whole list of people. I only see panelists.
Yeah. I'm not sure that that's possible, but you can just speak and they'll hear you.
Well, people are thanking us, and I would like to thank them so much for their attentive watching and listening, and thanks so much to everybody who was on the call, who was on the Zoom.
Yeah, and thank you, Robin, and I hope we get to talk again soon.
Me too. Thanks, Tom, for inviting me.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.